3,000 years before the Great War began, the Althari elders gathered the young races of the galaxy in the grand chambers of Nexus Prime. And the silence that filled that ancient hall was heavier than any star. The elders were beings of impossible age, creatures who had watched civilizations rise from dust and return to dust again. And their eyes held the weight of 10,000 worlds and 10,000 mistakes that could never be undone. Every young species sent their leaders to hear what the elders would say. For it was known across all the stars that the Althari were ascending to a higher plane of existence. And this would be their final gift to the galaxy they were leaving behind, the eldest among them. A being called Vathan, who had lived for 900,000 years, raised his hand, and the stars themselves seemed to dim in respect. "We have seen much," Vathan said, and his voice carried without effort to every corner of the vast chamber. "We have seen empires that stretched across 1,000,000 worlds crumble in a single generation. And we have seen tiny species grow to reshape the very fabric of reality." The young races listened with the reverence that only those who know they are hearing something precious can give. But in all our ages of watching, Vathan continued, "there is one warning we must leave you. One truth that you must carry forward when we are gone. And you must never forget it, no matter how many years pass or how much the memory fades." He raised his ancient hand and pointed toward a distant arm of the galaxy, toward a place that none of the young races had yet explored, in the Orion Spur. There is a pale blue world circling a yellow star, and on that world there are creatures unlike any you have ever known. The leaders of the young races leaned forward, curious about what could make the immortal elders speak with such weight in their voices. "They call themselves humans," Vathan said, "and they are still primitive, still fighting among themselves, still burning the ancient dead of their world to power their machines. But do not let this fool you," one of the young leaders, a Vorthani noble named Kresk, who was the ancestor of the one who would one day doom his people, spoke up with the arrogance that youth often carries. "Great Elder, why should we fear primitives who cannot even leave their own world?" Vathan turned his ancient eyes upon the Vorthani, and in that gaze was something that made even the proud noble shrink back in his seat, because they were not given their world. Vathan said, "They took it. And they took it not from gentle rivals, but from the very forces of extinction itself." The elder waved his hand, and images appeared in the air above them all. Images of a world that seemed determined to destroy everything that lived upon it. "Their world has tried to kill them 5 times, Vathan explained. "Great rocks from the sky, ice that covered everything, poison in the air and fire beneath the ground. And 5 times they should have died with all the other creatures. But 5 times they survived." The images showed small creatures huddled in caves while the world burned around them. Showed them hunting beasts 10 times their size with nothing but sharpened sticks and the fury of beings who refused to accept their own death. They learned something that no comfortable species ever learns. Vathan said, "They learned that survival is not a gift but a war. And they learned to fight that war with every breath they take." The old elder paused and looked across the gathered races with something that might have been sorrow or might have been fear. "When you find them, and you will find them someday, you must treat them with respect. For they have the capacity to be the greatest friends the galaxy has ever known." His voice grew darker, heavier, like a storm gathering on the horizon. "But if you treat them with cruelty, if you give them a reason to turn their fury upon you, then nothing in this galaxy will save you from what follows." He raised his hand one final time and spoke the words that would be carved into the celestial codex, the sacred law that would govern the galaxy for 3,000 years. "Leave the pale blue world untouched. For the creatures there dream of fire, and they were forged in extinction, and they do not know how to surrender." The elders departed that very cycle, ascending to whatever realm awaited beings who had grown beyond the need for physical form. And the young races were left alone with the warning that echoed in their minds for many centuries. The warning was honored without question, for the memory of the elders remained fresh, and their words carried the weight of absolute truth. But time does what time always does, and it eroded the sharp edges of memory until what was once a commandment became merely a tradition. And what was once truth became merely legend. The Vorthani Dominion grew powerful over 2,000 years, conquering 80 worlds and enslaving dozens of species beneath their rule. And with each victory, they grew more certain that the galaxy belonged to them by right. By the time High Sovereign Kalthus rose to power, the elders had become nothing more than myths, stories told to children to make them behave. And the Celestial Codex had become a dusty relic that few bothered to read when Vorthani scouts finally reached the Orion Spur and found the pale blue world the elders had warned about. They sent their reports back to the homeworld with excitement rather than Ferkalthos read the reports in his throne room, surrounded by advisors who had helped him conquer a dozen worlds. And he laughed at what he saw. "These humans cannot even stop fighting each other," he said, pointing at the images of wars and conflicts that covered the little blue planet. "They have crude machines and primitive weapons, and they waste their energy on squabbles that mean nothing." His chief advisor, a cautious old Vorthani named Desik, dared to speak the warning that others were too afraid to voice. "My sovereign, the Celestial Codex speaks of this world, and the elders themselves warned us to leave it alone." Kalthos turned his cold eyes upon his advisor and smiled the smile of someone who had never known defeat. "The elders were fools who disappeared rather than face the challenges of ruling," he declared. "They knew nothing of strength and nothing of conquest, and their warnings are the mutterings of cowards who feared their own shadows." He stood and raised his hand toward the star map that showed the pale blue world spinning peacefully around its yellow star. "Earth will be our newest colony," Kalthos announced, "and these humans will serve the Dominion as all inferior species must serve. And the galaxy will see once again that the Vorthani bow to no ancient superstition." The advisors bowed their heads in obedience, for none dared challenge the High Sovereign when his mind was set. And the orders went out to the great war fleet that had never known defeat across the galaxy, in halls that had stood empty for 3,000 years. Something stirred in the ancient archives of the elders, as if the very stones themselves knew that the warning had been forgotten and the price would soon be paid. And, on a small blue world in the Orion Spur, 6 billion humans lived their lives without any knowledge that their existence was about to change forever, without any idea that they were about to teach the galaxy a lesson it would never forget. The year was 2147 by the human calendar, and humanity had finally begun to reach beyond the world that had birthed them, with colonies on Mars and stations orbiting the moon. But they still believed they were alone in the universe. That belief died on a Tuesday morning when the sky over 12 of Earth's greatest cities turned dark with ships that no human hand had ever built. The Vorthani Warfleet arrived not with greetings but with demands, not with open hands but with weapons charged and ready. And High Sovereign Kalthos broadcast his message to every screen and speaker on the planet below. "Creatures of Earth." His voice rang out in a language that their translation machines converted perfectly. "I am High Sovereign Kalthos of the Vorthani Dominion, and your world now belongs to us, across the planet." Billions of humans stopped what they were doing and stared at the alien face on their screens, at the cold eyes that looked upon them like a farmer looks upon cattle. "You have 30 of your solar cycles to surrender unconditionally," Kalthos continued. "All of your governments will dissolve and all of your people will serve the Dominion. And in return, we will allow you to continue existing." He paused and let his thin lips curl into something that might have been a smile. "Resist, and you will learn what happens to species that defy their betters. The transmission ended, and for a long moment, the entire planet seemed to hold its breath. And in that silence, something ancient began to wake in the hearts of 6 billion people. The governments of Earth convened in emergency sessions. Generals and presidents and prime ministers all scrambling to understand what they faced. And the fear in those rooms was thick enough to choke on, but beneath the fear, there was something else. Something that the Vorthani had not expected and could not have understood even if they had known to look for Ida Factory. Worker in Detroit looked at the ships hovering over his city and felt his hands curl into fists at grandmother. In Tokyo, remembered the stories her own grandmother had told about surviving fire and ruin and building again from nothing. A teenager in Lagos stared at the alien fleet and felt not terror but anger. The kind of anger that burns slow and hot and never truly dies when the 30 days ended. The Vorthani expected surrender, expected delegations of frightened leaders begging for mercy, expected the easy victory that they had won on 50 worlds before. What they received instead was silent. Sekeltos waited in his command ship, growing more irritated with each passing hour, until finally he ordered his ground forces to begin the occupation. Certain that the humans had simply been too disorganized to respond, the first Vorthani troops landed in New York, in Beijing, in Moscow, in a dozen other cities, and they marched through the streets with the confidence of conquerors who had never tasted defeat. They did not understand why the streets were empty, why the buildings were dark, why the entire planet seemed to have gone quiet as a grave. Then the attacks began. They came not from armies, lined up in neat formations, but from everywhere and nowhere at once. From rooftops and sewers and basement windows. From people who should have been too old or too young or too scared to fight a Vorthani patrol walked down a street in Paris. And a man who had been a baker 3 weeks ago dropped a homemade explosive on them from a 4th floor window and disappeared before the smoke cleared. Squad of alien soldiers entered a school in Sydney that their sensors said was empty, and they found instead 30 teenagers with stolen weapons and absolutely no intention of being taken alive. An officer in Cairo ordered his troops to round up civilians for questioning, and an 80-year-old woman walked up to him with a bomb strapped beneath her coat and a smile on her face that he did not understand until it was too late. The Vorthani tactical computers had predicted that conquering Earth would take 2 weeks and cost perhaps 1,000 soldiers, but by the end of the first week alone, they had lost 40,000 troops, not to superior technology, not to advanced weapons, not to anything the Dominion had ever faced before, but to something far more dangerous, to a species that simply refused to stop fighting. Reports flooded back to Kelthos on his command ship, each one more disturbing than the last. And for the first time in his long reign, the High Sovereign felt something unfamiliar crawling up his spine. They do not surrender, his commanders told him. They do not retreat. They do not negotiate. They simply keep coming no matter how many we kill. They are using their own bodies as weapons, another reported. They strap explosives to themselves and walk into our formations. And they smile when they do it. Their children are memorizing our patrol routes and reporting to resistance cells, a third commander said, and there was genuine horror in his voice. Their elderly are fighting alongside their young, and none of them seem to care if they die. Kelthos stared at the reports and tried to understand what he was facing, tried to fit these humans into the categories he knew. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for a species that treated war like a personal insult rather than a political calculation. He made his decision with the cold logic that had served him well for decades. The logic that said, if an enemy would not submit, then they must be taught the cost of defiance. Orbital bombardment, he ordered. 3 cities, the largest population centers that are still resisting. And make sure the rest of the planet can see what happens to those who defy us. his officers hesitated for just a moment, for the laws of galactic civilization frowned upon such measures. But Kalthos was their sovereign, and his word was absolute. The warships moved into position over Shanghai, over Sao Paulo, over London, and their weapons powered up with a hum that could be felt in the bones of every human below. The bombardment lasted 7 minutes, and when it was over, 19 million people were dead. 3 great cities reduced to craters that glowed with the heat of artificial suns. Kalthos broadcast to the planet again, showing the smoking ruins to every human with eyes to see. "This is the price of resistance," he declared. "Surrender now or watch more of your cities burn, for we have weapons enough to turn your entire world to glass." He waited for the surrender that surely must come now, for no species could endure such loss without breaking. For this was how the Dominion had always crushed resistance, and this was how it would always work. But as the hours passed and then the days, as the fires in the ruined cities cooled and the smoke began to clear, Kalthos realized that something was very wrong. The humans were not surrendering. They were not fleeing or begging or breaking. They were mobilizing across the planet. In every nation and every city and every village, humans who had been divided by language and politics and ancient grudges looked at the ruins of 19 million of their kind and made a choice within 72 hours. Every government on Earth had joined together in a single unified command. The fastest political consolidation in the history of any species the Dominion had ever encountered within a week. Every factory on the planet had shifted to war production, running day and night with workers who slept in shifts and kept the machines running even when their bodies begged for rest. Within a month, the first captured Vorthani weapons had been reverse-engineered and improved, modified by human ingenuity into something that the original designers would not have recognized, and in the eyes of every human being on Earth, from the oldest veteran to the youngest child, there burned a fire that Kalthos had never seen before. A fire that he was only beginning to understand. It was not hatred. Though there was hatred in it, it was not rage. The rage was certainly part of it, but it was something older and deeper and far more dangerous. Something that the Vorthani had awakened without meaning to. Something that the elders had tried to warn them about 3,000 years ago. The humans had a word for it. A word that they whispered to each other in the dark of night and shouted from the rooftops of ruined cities. They called it wrath, and they were only getting started. In the 5 years that followed the bombardment, humanity transformed itself in ways that the galaxy had never witnessed and would never forget. The ruins of Shanghai and Sao Paulo and London became shrines, places where humans came to stand in silence and remember, and to renew the oath that had spread across the planet like wildfire in the days after the attack. They called it the doctrine of wrath, and his words were simple enough that every human knew them by heart. We did not start this war, but we will finish it, not when we are satisfied, but when they are extinct. The Vorthani had expected the bombardment to break human resistance within days, but instead, they found themselves facing an enemy that grew stronger with every passing month. An enemy that seemed to feed on its own losses rather than weaken from them. Human scientists worked in shifts that would have killed most galactic species, sleeping only 4 hours in every 40, driven by a combination of stimulants and pure fury that kept their minds sharp even as their bodies screamed for rest. They tore apart captured Vorthani technology with the desperate hunger of people who knew that understanding was the key to survival. And they did not merely copy what they found, but improved it, adapting alien engineering to human creativity in ways that should have taken decades, but happened in mere months. The Vorthani engineers who examined the first human-modified weapons could not believe what they were seeing. "They have changed everything," one engineer reported to his superiors. "They have taken our designs and twisted them, made them cruder in some ways but more powerful in others. And they have done it faster than our models said was possible. But it was not just technology that transformed in those years. It was the humans themselves. Admiral Chen Wei had been a naval officer of moderate rank before the invasion. A woman who had served her country with quiet competence and never dreamed of commanding more than a single ship. Her daughter had been studying medicine in Shanghai when the bombardment came. A young woman with her mother's eyes and her father's laugh, who had wanted nothing more than to help people heal. She died with 19 million others in 7 minutes of fire from the sky. Chen Wei did not break when she learned of her daughter's death. Though many who knew her waited for the grief to consume her, instead, something in her eyes changed. Something that made even the bravest soldiers step back when they met her gaze. And she requested transfer to the newly formed United Earth Navy with a voice that carried no emotion at all. Within 3 years, she had risen to command humanity's first interstellar fleet. A collection of ships that had been built with stolen technology and human determination. Vessels that the Vorthani tactical computers classified as primitive and no significant threat on the day the fleet was ready to launch. Chen Wei stood before the crews who would follow her into the unknown. 10,000 men and women who had all lost someone to the bombardment or the occupation. And she spoke the words that would echo through history. They came to our world and demanded that we kneel, she said, and her voice was steady as stone. They murdered our children and burned our cities and told us that this was the price of resistance. She paused and looked across the faces before her. Faces that held no fear, only the cold patience of people who had been waiting for this moment. They wanted to teach us fear, Chen Wei continued. But today we go to teach them what fear truly means. The fleet jumped to faster than light speed using engines that human engineers had built in 18 months from captured Vorthani designs. Engines that should have taken a decade to develop and another decade to perfect. They emerged in the Vorthani border systems like wolves, appearing in a flock of sheep. And they did not waste time with demands or negotiations or any of the rituals that civilized species were supposed to observe. They simply attacked. The first Vorthani colony to fall was a world called Desser, a mining outpost with a population of 3 million and a defense fleet of 12 ships. The humans arrived with 30 vessels, crude and ugly compared to the elegant Vorthani designs, but crewed by men and women who flew like they had nothing to lose, because they truly believed they had nothing to lose. The battle lasted 4 hours, and when it was over, every Vorthani ship had been destroyed, and every military installation on the surface had been reduced to rubble. The human fleet did not stay to occupy the world, did not demand surrender from the civilian population, did not follow any of the protocols that the Vorthani had expected. They simply transmitted a single message to the terrified colonists below and then jumped away to find their next target. Tell your sovereign that humanity remembers, the message said. Tell him that we are coming across the galaxy. Observers from neutral species watched the reports coming out of Vorthani space with growing unease. For what they were seeing did not match anything in their understanding of warfare. Galactic civilization had developed rules for conflict over millions of years. Rules about proportional response and acceptable casualties, and the treatment of civilians and 100 other conventions that made war predictable and manageable. Humans seemed not to know these rules existed. Or perhaps they simply did not care. They did not calculate acceptable losses. They fought until they won or until they were all dead. And they showed no interest in retreat, even when the numbers turned against them. They did not seek to capture or occupy. They sought to destroy, systematically dismantling every military asset they could find while leaving civilian populations untouched. But terrified, they did not negotiate. Every attempt by the Vorthani to open communications was met with the same response. A recording of the bombardment playing on loop with no other message attached, the collective intelligence of Nexus Prime. The ancient machine that had served as the galaxy's primary strategic analyst for 8,000 years, issued a report that sent shockwaves through every species that read it. Human warfare psychology does not match any known pattern. The report stated, they appear to treat military conflict not as a political tool, but as a personal matter, engaging with an emotional investment that our models cannot account for. The report continued with, increasingly alarmed observations, recommended response, immediate cessation of hostilities and unconditional return of human territory, with reparations calculated at maximum sustainable levels. High Sovereign Kalthos read the report and dismissed it as cowardice, for the Dominion had never surrendered and would not begin now, and he ordered his remaining fleets to consolidate for a decisive counterattack, but his admirals and generals were beginning to have doubts, for they had seen the recordings from the front lines and watched human pilots deliberately crash their damaged ships into Vorthani vessels rather than eject to safety, and seen human soldiers advance into certain death with expressions that looked almost like joy. What kind of species does this? One admiral asked in a private meeting, and no one had an answer that made any sense. The humans continued their advance, taking world after world with losses that should have crippled any normal fleet, but somehow only seemed to make them angrier. And in the great archives of Nexus Prime, where the warnings of the elders had gathered dust for 3,000 years, the ancient texts began to be read again by those who were finally ready to listen. They do not know how to surrender, the elders had written, and now the galaxy was learning what those words truly meant. The Vorthani Dominion had taken 2,000 years to conquer 80 worlds, building an empire through careful strategy and overwhelming force. And they had believed themselves invincible. The humans took 14 of those worlds in 3 years, and they showed no signs of slowing down. High Sovereign Kalthos stood before the Galactic Conclave for the first time in his reign, a proud ruler forced to beg for help from species he had always considered beneath his notice. The humans are a threat to all civilized peoples, he declared to the assembled representatives of 100 worlds. Their aggression knows no bounds, and their methods violate every convention of warfare that our ancestors established. He raised his hands in a gesture that was meant to convey sincerity, but came across as desperation. The conclave must intervene before these primitives destroy the balance of power that has kept peace in the galaxy for millennia. The representatives listened in silence, their faces unreadable, and when Kalthos finished speaking, there was a long pause before anyone responded. The Theshan ambassador, a being whose species had been conquered by the Vorthani 300 years ago and still chafed under their rule, was the first to speak. If I understand correctly, she said with perfect diplomatic neutrality, you are asking us to help you stop a species that you attacked without provocation, whose cities you destroyed without warning, and whose people you attempted to enslave. Kalthos bristled at the characterization but could not deny it. The circumstances of first contact are irrelevant, he said. What matters now is containing a clear and present danger to galactic security. The Rithani representative, whose world had lost millions to Vorthani expansion, made a sound that might have been laughter. You burned their cities and killed their children, he said. And now you come to us wondering why they are angry. Before Kalos could respond, the doors of the conclave chamber opened and a new delegation entered, one that sent whispers racing through the assembled representatives. The humans had arrived. Ambassador Yelena Akunko walked at the head of the delegation, a tall woman with gray in her hair and steel in her eyes, and she moved with the calm confidence of someone who had nothing left to fear. Behind her came a small group of aides and officers, including Admiral Chun Wei herself, whose reputation had spread through the galaxy. Like a virus, the conclave fell silent as the humans took their seats at the table that had been hastily prepared for them. And every eye in the chamber watched to see what these strange creatures would do. The conclave moderator, an ancient being of a species so old that no one remembered their original name, raised a hand for attention. The representatives of Earth have been invited to these proceedings as an interested party, the moderator announced. They have been granted observer status and the right to speak when recognized. Kelthos turned to face the human delegation. And for a moment the two leaders simply looked at each other across the chamber, measuring, calculating. Hating, I trust that you have come to negotiate a reasonable end to hostilities, Kelthos said, forcing his voice to remain steady. The Dominion is prepared to discuss terms that would benefit both our peoples. Ambassador Okonkwo tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words, and then she smiled. It was not a warm smile. You want to negotiate, she said, and her voice carried easily through the silent chamber. You want to sit at a table and discuss terms, as if what has happened between us was merely a misunderstanding between equals. She stood and walked slowly toward the center of the chamber, where the holographic display systems awaited her command. Let me show you what you are asking us to forget. The air filled with images, recordings that had been gathered from Earth in the days and weeks after the bombardment. The ruins of Shanghai still smoking, with rescue workers digging through rubble that had once been homes and hospitals and schools. The survivors of Snow Paulo, wandering through streets that had become graveyards, searching for family members they would never find. The children of London, orphaned in an instant, staring at the sky with eyes that had seen too much too young and through it all. The death count scrolling across the bottom of the display, 19 million. Written in numbers that seemed too large to be real, 19 million people, Okonkwo said. Mothers and fathers and children, artists and teachers and doctors. People who had done nothing wrong except live on a world that you decided you wanted. She turned back to face Kelthos, and there was no anger in her expression, only a terrible calm. You did not just kill them, she continued. You made the rest of us watch, because you wanted us to learn fear. The chamber was utterly silent now. The representatives of 100 worlds, transfixed by the small human woman, who stood before them without a trace of fear. So let me tell you what we learned instead, Okonkwo said. We learned that the galaxy is not safe, that there are species out there who will burn our cities and murder our children for the crime of existing. And we learned that no one will protect us except ourselves. She pointed at the assembled representatives, sweeping her arm across the chamber. You watched, she said. You all watched what they did to us, and you did nothing. Because we were primitive and weak, and you did not think we mattered. Several representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, for her words struck close to truths that none of them wanted to acknowledge. So here is humanity's first lesson to the galaxy, Okonkwo declared. We remember everything, and we do not forgive. Kelthos stepped forward, his patience exhausted. You speak of memory and forgiveness as if they give you the right to wage unlimited war, he said. But the laws of this conclave demand proportional response, and you have long since exceeded any reasonable measure of justice. Okonkwo turned to face him directly, and though she was shorter than the Vorthani sovereign, somehow she seemed to tower over him. You speak to me of proportion, she said. You, who killed 19 million people to punish us for not surrendering quickly enough. She stepped closer, close enough that Kelthos had to resist the urge to step back. There is no proportion in what you did, she continued. And there will be no proportion in what we do, because you taught us that proportional response is for species that can afford to lose. Admiral Chun Wei spoke for the first time, her voice flat and cold. We cannot afford to lose, she said. So we will not lose, no matter what it costs, no matter how long it takes, no matter what rules we have to break. The conclave moderator raised a hand for order, but before speaking, asked a question that many in the chamber wanted answered. What would it take for humanity to make peace? Okonkwo did not hesitate. The complete dissolution of the Vorthani dominion, she said. The liberation of every species they have enslaved. The trial of every leader who participated in the decision to attack Earth. And the permanent demilitarization of their homeworld. Kalthos made a sound of outrage. But Okonkwo continued before he could speak, and in return, humanity will offer something to the galaxy that has never been offered before. She turned to face the assembled representatives. And when she spoke again, her voice had changed. Had become something almost gentle. We will protect you, she said. Not because you protected us, because you did not, but because we know what it is to be small and afraid and alone. The words hung in the air, unexpected and strange. And the representatives looked at each other in confusion. We are what we are because the universe tried to kill us and we refused to die. Okonkwo continued. And we will use what we have become to make sure that no other species has to face what we faced alone. She smiled again, and this time there was warmth in it. Warmth that seemed impossible from someone who had just promised to destroy an empire. That is the choice the galaxy faces now, she said. Stand with us and share our protection, or stand against us and share the fate of those who tried to make us afraid. The conclave voted 3 hours later, and the result was unanimous. The Vorthani Dominion would face humanity alone. The human fleet arrived at Vorthan Prime on a day that the Vorthani had hoped would never come. 12,000 ships emerging from faster-than-light travel, like a storm that had finally reached the shore high. Sovereign Kalthos watched from the great window of his palace as the sky filled with the vessels of the species he had tried to enslave. The species he had been warned about and had ignored. And for the first time in his life, he understood true fear. The Vorthani had gathered every ship. They had left for this final defense. 2,000 vessels crewed by soldiers who knew they were fighting for the survival of everything they had ever known. It was not enough, and they knew it was not enough. But they had no choice except to fight or die without trying. Admiral Chun Wei commanded the human fleet from the bridge of the UE's Remembrance, a name that she had chosen herself for a ship that had been built with the metal from the ruins of Shanghai. She looked at the tactical display showing the enemy formation and felt nothing at all. For she had stopped feeling years ago, had become something cold and sharp and perfectly focused on the single purpose that remained to her. All ships, she said, and her voice carried to every captain in the fleet. Begin the attack. The battle that followed would be studied in war academies across the galaxy for centuries to come. Not because it was close, but because it revealed something that military strategists had never fully understood. The Vorthani fought well. Fought with the courage of beings defending their home. Fought with tactics that would have defeated any normal enemy. But the humans did not fight like a normal enemy. They pressed forward through losses that should have broken any fleet, closing to ranges where their less sophisticated weapons could do maximum damage. Trading ships for ships in exchanges that favored no one, and when Vorthani captains tried to withdraw damaged vessels from the line, they found human ships pursuing them with a relentlessness that seemed almost mechanical, as if the humans could not even conceive of letting an enemy escape. 3 hours into the battle, the Vorthani fleet had been reduced by half, and the humans had lost a third of their ships. And any reasonable military calculation would have called for both sides to disengage and regroup. The humans did not disengage. They pushed harder, faster, accepting casualties that would have caused mutiny in any other navy. And their communications channels filled not with reports of damage or requests for assistance, but with something that the Vorthani had never heard in battle before. They were laughing, not the laughter of madness. Though it might have sounded that way to those who did not understand, it was the laughter of release. The laughter of people who had carried a weight for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. The laughter of human beings who had finally found their enemy within reach by the 5th hour. The Vorthani fleet had effectively ceased to exist, and the surviving ships were fleeing in all directions. And the human fleet hung in orbit above a world that had no defense left. High Sovereign Kalthos received the transmission in his throne room. Surrounded by advisors who had run out of advice and guards who knew they could not protect him from what was coming, Admiral Chen Wei appeared on the screen. Her face as calm as it had been at the start of the battle. Her eyes as empty as the space between stars. You have 1 hour to surrender your military installations and your government officials, she said. If you comply, your civilian population will not be harmed. Kalthos stared at the face of his enemy and searched for something to say. Some argument or threat or plea that might change what was about to happen. He found nothing. And if I refuse? He asked because he had to ask. Because a Vorthani High Sovereign did not surrender without at least asking the question. Chen Wei tilted her head slightly. Considering the question, then you will die, she said. And we will take what we came for anyway. And the only difference will be how many of your people die with you. She paused, and something flickered in her eyes. Something that might have been the ghost of the woman she had been before her daughter died. I am offering you this choice because there are children on your world, she said. And unlike you, we do not murder children to make a point. Kalthos looked around at his advisors. At the guards who would die for him if he asked. At the empire he had built and was about to lose. And he made the only decision that was left to make. The surrender was signed within the hour. And human troops landed on Vortham Prime, not as conquerors, but as liberators. Freeing the slave species that the Dominion had held for centuries and securing the officials who would face trial for their crimes. Kalthos himself was taken into custody without ceremony. Without speeches, without any of the drama that he had expected, he was simply one more prisoner. One more piece of business to be handled, and the humans who guarded him did not even seem to hate him. Indifference was somehow worse than hatred would have been. The trial was held not on Earth, but on Desser, the first world that humanity had freed. And the judges were not humans, but members of the species that the Vorthani had oppressed. The humans did not attend, did not even send observers, as if Kalthos and everything he represented had become irrelevant. The moment his fleet was destroyed, Ambassador Okonkwo explained their absence to the Galactic Conclave in a session that would be remembered for generations. We did not fight for justice, she said. We fought for survival, and now that we have survived, we have no interest in vengeance. She looked around the chamber at the representatives who had once ignored humanity and now listened to every word. The Vorthani are your problem now, she continued. Judge them by your laws. Punish them according to your customs. Rebuild your worlds as you see fit. The Veshan ambassador asked the question that everyone wanted answered. What does humanity want now that the war is over? Okonkwo smiled, and it was the first genuine smile that any of them had seen from a human since the war began. We want what we have always wanted, she said. To live in peace, to raise our children without fear, to explore and create and grow. She paused, and her smile faded into something more serious. But we have learned that peace must be defended, and we have become very good at defense. In the years that followed, humanity kept its promise. They did not seek to build an empire, did not attempt to dominate the galaxy, did not use their newfound power to oppress the weak as the Vorthani had done. Instead, they became something that the galaxy had never seen before. Protectors who asked for nothing in return except the right to exist. When the Kreth hegemony began to threaten its neighbors, human diplomats appeared with warnings backed by the fleet that had destroyed the Dominion. And the hegemony decided that expansion was not worth the risk when the Valish plague threatened to wipe out 3 species. Human scientists worked alongside galactic researchers to find a cure, sharing their knowledge freely and expecting no payment when slave traders tried to rebuild their networks in the chaos left by the Dominion's fall. Human ships hunted them down with the same relentless determination they had shown in the war 40 years after the final battle. Humanity was granted a permanent seat on the Galactic Conclave. And Ambassador Okonkwo's daughter accepted the honor on behalf of her species in the great archives of Nexus Prime. Scholars unsealed the complete records of the Althari Elders for the first time in 3,000 years. Searching for understanding of what had happened and what it meant, they found not just a warning that had been ignored, but a note that had never been released. Words written by Vathan himself in the final days before the Elders ascended. "We do not warn you because humans are evil." The note read, "We warn you because they are us, what we were before we forgot how to fight." The scholars read on, their eyes widening with each line. "Treat them with respect, and they will be the greatest friends the galaxy has ever known. For they have a capacity for love that matches their capacity for war. Treat them with cruelty, and they will remind you why the universe learned to fear the dark." The final line was inscribed on a monument that now stands on Nexus Prime, a monument to the Elders and to the lesson that humanity had taught the galaxy. They came from a world of death and struggle, and they learned to love fiercely, hate deeply, and never, ever quit. Handle with care, handle with respect, and never, ever give them a reason to remember your name. In the end, the galaxy learned what the Elders had always known, that humanity was not a threat to be contained, but a force to be befriended. Not monsters to be feared, but survivors who understood what it meant to face extinction and refused to accept it. Somewhere in the higher dimensions where the Elders had gone, Vathan watched and smiled, because his children had finally learned to listen. It had only taken a war to teach them.